Okay, everyone, thanks for joining us. Uh, we are really excited. I hope you got a chance to watch the fantastic film, What is Democracy? And in fact, I even enjoyed it even more the second time because there's so much there. So I just want to mention that if you haven't been able to watch the film yet, that you still have the chance if you registered until Monday, at the end of Monday. So great opportunity if you didn't get a chance to finish. Um, Also, if you haven't had a chance, we welcome, if you're able to have a donation to cover our cost and for the film, and perhaps support our work, the work of our two organizations, and we'll tell you a little bit about us here in just a few moments there. We're delighted to co-sponsor this event with Simply Living, and if you don't know about them or the Ohio Community Rights Network, we will let you know. In the chat, you'll see that there is a link for if you want to, are able to give a donation to help defray the cost of the film. And also there's a link to Simply Living. Before I introduce Astra, who's our guest and the filmmaker, let's just share a little bit about our two organizations. So Chuck Lynn is with Simply Living. So Chuck, can you say a few words about what Simply Living is? Because we've got people that are from all over and they may not know about Simply Living. So go ahead and then I'll share what we are, or who we are.
Yes, I'm Chuck Lynn, and I'm a founding board member in 1992 of Simply Living. So we've been around quite a while. We're small, but we're mighty. We're networked with all the environmental organizations, and we're a little different in that we're critical of the global consumer economy. So we love this movie. We felt like, or I felt, I'll speak for myself, that it did a really good job of like talking about what democracy really is. And we're much focused on localization, about the human scale, and creating structures so that actual democracy can happen and at whatever level. But that came through to me and resonated in the film. And we're very much focused on the ecological footprint of everybody as we make our decisions. And we can have a big impact globally if we all kind of pay attention and make those decisions together. And that's what we're about. But we're also about the policies and the ideas for how to localize on a grander scale.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. And the Ohio Community Rights Network, it's a network of community members throughout the state of Ohio. And our members are from more than 10 different counties who've worked in their communities to expand the rights of self-governance and rights of nature. It's collectively working to establish a more expansive network of just communities in Ohio that are working to advance, secure, and protect the right of local self-governance and the rights of nature. So we're delighted to have Astra Taylor with us. She's a documentary filmmaker, writer, political organizer. She is the filmmaker, the director most recently of What is Democracy, which you hopefully got a chance to see, or you still have a chance, and the author of, and here's her book here that I have, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And it's, if you want even more deep dive on democracy, I highly recommend it. And her previous work includes the People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age, which is another big problem that is related to democracy, I think, as well. And it's a winner of the 2015 American Book Award. So she's also the co-founder of the Debt Collective. So welcome, Astra, and thanks for joining us. And let me just start. I'll start with a couple questions that I have, and then we'll open it up. So those who are joining us, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat there, and we'll try to take as many of those as we can. So first of all, I'd like to start with thinking about, we as Americans, we like to refer to our democracy, which really is designed as a representative democracy, but does it effectively function as one? And so when we think about that the majority of people want things like national health care, a living wage, sensible gun restrictions, campaign finance reforms, etc. But these things aren't getting implemented. So what are the major obstacles and forces, as you see it, that are preventing the people from getting these things enacted and having a more effective democratic system? I know that's a big one there, but I know some of them are obvious, but maybe some of them aren't.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored, and especially to be with people who are kindred spirits in the sense of thinking about, I feel when you're talking about rights of nature or these sorts of things that we're talking about pushing democracy towards this horizon, right? We're not at the end of this experiment. We haven't figured out all of the entities deserving of rights of being included. And so I'm happy to and feel like I have an invitation to sort of think big and talk about what I really think, actually. I'm also happy that, as people working on environmental issues, you felt there was a resonance with the film, because to me, you can't fit everything into a feature-length documentary. And so it was very hard for me to leave out a kind of conscious discussion of the ecological crisis we're in. I get into it much more in the book. In different ways, but that's something that, it was there and on my mind in the film as I try to talk about the tension between the local and the global, and the fact that we can't ignore these bigger problems, the problems that are not just bigger than our communities, but bigger than our countries, right? Climate change is not something we can solve at the national level or even the local level alone. It is indeed a global issue. So what is wrong with our democracy? What I tried to say in the title of the book is, democracy may not exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. What I'm trying to do is kind of recognize that there has been democratic progress, that I would be someone not worthy of political rights a century ago. People had to fight for the inclusion of people who didn't have property. I mean, within the American political system, right? People without property, Black people, women, and so on. So, I want to recognize that progress and that effort and the lives that were lost in this, but to also say we're not there yet. Democracy still doesn't exist in the sense that we don't live in a system that's fully inclusive, egalitarian, that lives up to the idea of the people ruling together. And one way we could say this is, the system we live in is not representative. I like the idea of a representative democracy. I think that's a good idea. We should try it. But there's all sorts of questions about, well, how do you do representation well? So one thing I should say in the film is, elections aren't the only way to do representation. You could have selection, you could have sortition, you could randomly call up citizens like we do in juries and say, let's have citizens councils. There are all sorts of mechanisms, or, Chuck used the word structures. How do you structure democracy? How do you structure representation? The way our political system structures representation is very unrepresentative. And so there's a lot to lament in this moment, but I guess I'll say that it's heartening that there's more of a discussion about basic problems of representation in the American political system. So for example, the Electoral College and how deeply unrepresentative that is. The nature of the Senate and the fact that every state has 2 senators regardless of their population. So we end up having a very small state like Wyoming having as many representatives in the Senate, this incredibly powerful body, as California or New York, and then Washington, D.C. has no representation. So, or the Supreme Court, the fact that 9 life-appointed justices can essentially have a kind of veto over progressive legislations. I mean, you just pointed out, I think rightly, Bill, that all of these, progressive social policies are popular. So, but even today with the Democrats, who are not the small d Democratic Party, but the big D, the Democrats controlling the House and the Senate and the presidency, they are still up against the structure of minority rule in our American political system. So the fact that the filibuster gives the Republicans the ability to block legislation in the Senate, the fact that even if they did pass progressive reforms. The Supreme Court could undercut those. So we have a deeply unrepresentative system, and that goes back to who founded this country and what their priorities were. And they were very worried about majority rule because they were a minority. They were a minority of wealthy, affluent, property owning men. And so they were, democratic in some respects for their time, but deeply undemocratic in others. They left us a very, very mixed legacy. And I think we're still wrestling with it. So I end the book with this image of, let us not aspire to be founding fathers and let us not fetishize the founding fathers. Let us instead aim to be perennial midwives birthing democracy anew. And I think we really, at the heart of that needs to be a lack of fear of majorities, right? I think that democracy is about faith in people, faith in the power of majorities. Not always, democracy is complicated, but our system that we live in the United States is deeply minoritarian, and it allows for all these chokeholds. And a lot of them are based on, also the fact that, again, this minority that the founders wanted to protect was a wealthy minority. And so we have a system that's very distorted by money and the power that money buys. So, and so that's where we are. And what we have to do to counter that is build people power and be very strategic in, what we are aspiring to do collectively to change things. Yeah.
Well, when you talk about, also the structures that we have. And so one of the things in the community rights movement that we talk about is what we call the box of allowable activism. And what are these barriers that are keeping us with the system that we have currently from getting what we want? And some of the things, you mentioned some of these things that have to do with the fact that our government's not representative, but there's also things such as like state preemption, where more and more this is a practice where the states are saying, we're going to take away power from the local municipalities so they can't pass laws, keeping or raising minimum wage or banning
gun control in Florida.
Yes. So many issues, and it seems to be expanding. And it seems like when one state does it, all the other states that are from the same party end up trying to pass these same laws as well. So that's one thing, is this preemption there. The other notion, or another one, is that notion of property, that workers are property. I know in your book you talk about when you go to work, it's not a very democratic place, the way you operate, and nature is property. That people, if they own it, they can do what they want with it. And maybe that's part of the reason that we've gotten, or the majority reason we've got a climate crisis now. We talk about the corporate privileges, that corporations have more rights than we do, the rights of personhood and all the amendments that they use. And also the belief in the system, that people still believe in the regulatory system. And we see the system as a regulatory fallacy because a lot of the regulations were created by the very businesses that we're trying to regulate, and people go to the hearings, but the way it works is if they've done XYZ correctly, they get their permit to do their harm, whatever it is in your community. So if they want to put injection wells of fracking waste in your community, or they want to do these things, then they can do it there. So so we see these things that, and perhaps the biggest one, and maybe you can also speak to all of those in this, is our doubt that we can really change the system. That people feel like, oh, it's just too overwhelming there. We're working because we think we still have to have hope. Otherwise, there's no chance. So what are your thoughts about those things?
Maybe I'll work backwards a bit. I mean, so I agree with all of those obstacles. I'm thinking about, there's a woman named Miriam Kaba. She's becoming more and more prominent as someone who works on racial justice and prison abolition. And she says, hope is a discipline. So I think that's a really good thing to be in. Hope isn't just I'm optimistic by nature, or I'm optimism of the will, or whatever it is. It's that hope is a discipline. And for me, I take inspiration from history. Again, looking at the circumstances under which other people organized that were a lot more arduous than what I'm dealing with. But these obstacles are really real. The home rule one is really interesting in preemption because, of course, Republicans famously, conservatives famously invoke states' rights, right? But they did so to suppress Black freedom and multiracial solidarity and democracy, right?
Yeah.
This is what happened after Jim Crow. And so states' rights, this is something, I guess this is one of those things where a lot of things are not inherently democratic or anti-democratic, right? It's the values we are putting into them. So, local control can be democratic and really important. It's about power. It's about who has power, whether that power is broadly shared and who's using it for what. So of course, in this moment where there are, I think, these progressive majorities on the ground, then conservatives are saying, well, yeah, we don't want local control. Actually, we want to shore up power and suppress that. I think a lot, right now I'm writing a book with a friend on solidarity, because I think solidarity is it's a part of democracy. They're not the same thing, but if we're going to build the power to make a more democratic society, we have to figure out how to build solidarity, especially solidarity across difference. And so I've been writing this chapter this week about all the ways solidarity is sabotaged. And I think that's kind of, I guess, my way this week of thinking about your thing of like with a box of acceptable activism, right? So there are these, local hearings that we go to, but they're just a kind of political theater. And then that makes you feel demoralized. And so then you don't want to be involved. And so I think we have to, just, work against that and figure out creative levers that haven't been tried before, which is why I think the work that people are doing with CELDF and around the rights of nature is so creative. Right now, I work, so maybe to ground these abstractions, I make films, I write, but then I organize a debtors union. So just like there are labor unions, I helped found a union for debtors. And what we're trying to do with that is figure out, well, okay, labor unions are so constrained. It's illegal to strike in solidarity with another group of workers. that you're not allowed to express your political values in solidarity. It's sabotage. It's illegal. But nobody's made laws against debtor organizing because it's not, we're kind of making the road while walking. We're just starting it. And, it's a powerful, we believe, a powerful form of political action because especially over the last 30, 40 years, people are so indebted because people are underpaid. They're in debt. So this debt, is somebody else's profits. The corporations and the government are expecting this money to come in. So we're saying, well, what if people used it what if people collectively bargained? Or what if people sort of realize, oh, I'm in debt for this medical bill because I'm not being granted universal health care. I have student loan debt because I don't have, free access to higher education like my grandparents did. And so, we have to, in the face of this box, we have to be creative. Where can we chew our way out of it? What can we do? What power are we leaving on the table that we might not, recognize as power to begin with? Because, and then the thing is, the more effective you are, the more they're going to fight back. So I guess I just feel like, if there's one silver lining, it's like, well, we get to try to be creative. We have to try to figure out how to see this struggle in a way that allows us to find some new strategies, some new angle, and to not just accept those channels that they're giving us, right? Like, okay, well, just vote and go home. Oh yeah, come and make a statement at the public hearing, but that's it. It's like, no, we'll do that. We'll vote, but we'll do all of this other stuff too, and try to creatively combat this power structure. And I think the last thing I'll say on that is corporate personhood. I write about that in the companion book, and it was quite an act of creativity, right? They take, what is it, the 14th Amendment? Sorry. Yeah, which was meant to, right, equal opportunity. So it was a post-emancipation amendment that's supposed to liberate Black people who were formerly enslaved. And then these railroad lawyers come by and go, oh, well, the language is a bit vague there. What if we said these were corporate persons? I mean, I think we need to be just as imaginative and just as bold. We'll never be as well funded. But that's thinking outside the box. And now you're right, now these corporate persons, they have, incredible rights, and they basically have eternal life because corporations rarely die.
Right. Yeah, exactly. One other thing, then I'll start opening up to the questions. That makes me think about also our Constitution. We have such reverence for it. And like you said, the respect of the founding fathers, you can't possibly question it. And we have like a Federalist society, and the judges that are getting appointed are like, let's see what the original intent was. Well, we're not living back in that time. And could the founding fathers ever think about global warming or about these assault weapons or things like that? These are things that we need to document for us. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and also they didn't agree. It's not, they were of mixed minds. I mean, there was one guy, I always forget his name, but he's one of the unnamed founding fathers, because there were quite a lot of them. And he, was like against age, he thought basically like there shouldn't be age restrictions. And he was actually suggested sortition. So doing a kind of lottery system. I mean, they weren't even a monolith. So this idea that there's some originalist interpretation and that we need to have this real, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who is one of my favorite historians, she wrote Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. She says, we treat the document with this religious theological reference when it's a political artifact, so, and it contains a lot of contradictions, and so it's ridiculous.
There's a lot of racist things in there too,
oh yeah,
as well as when we talk about how corporations have so much power, there's the takings clause and the contracts clause, which basically, and you speak about in your book too, about the overvaluation of rights of property, and that's really what it was based on.
Yeah, and I totally agree. The question, what is property, is a political. Also, everything is political. What counts as a crime is political. So you can go murder people if you're in the army, but so everything is contextual. And what is property? How we structure property is also very much a political question. And why we don't have more forms of collective property, why we don't have a more why we have this system we have it's just not etched in stone. So I think that's one thing all my projects are trying to do, is get people to see the history out of which these relationships emerged, and then to say they could be different. But certainly for me, your point about the fact we treat the non-human world as property actually leads to a lot of very pathological, destructive consequences, because then you just see it as something you can use up, something that's yours to sort of alienate and destroy. It's just, instead of and treating it as a resource instead of something that you're actually in relationship with.
Yeah, right. Aren't we part of nature? Yeah. Well, let me turn to some questions I got. So here's a first question. Why did you include so much footage about immigration, and how does that issue relate to democracy?
Yeah. I think it really does relate to democracy. I think the standard story, I was trying to do a lot of things in the movie. There were a lot of sort of things that I was thinking about that aren't said. But one is to challenge who is considered an expert in democracy. So, I think the word democracy, it comes from the Greek. Now, the Greeks didn't give us the practice of egalitarian self-government, because it was not a perfectly egalitarian society, but they gave us the word democracy, demos and kratos. So the people have power. And so I think there is something in democracy that is, you don't have to have a PhD in democracy to be part of it. It's the people. And so there's this aspect of trust in that we'll figure things out together. I think there is inherent to democracy a need for philosophy, because you have to deliberate, you have to debate, you have to think about, well, who is the people, right? That's a philosophical concept you already have to get your head around. So I wanted to kind of, challenge, decenter people who are experts or even politicians, and show democracy as something the people do. And I think there's a deeper part of that, which is that throughout history, the people who have really pushed democracy forward have almost always been excluded. That's this deep paradox of democracy. It's people who literally don't have rights, who are non-citizens, excluded from the demos completely, who fight. And they don't just fight for inclusion in the center, but by being included, they transform the center, right? Like when you have inclusion, you change the thing and you expand it and deepen it, I hope. So women, no political rights, basically property of husbands, right? Formerly enslaved people, literal property. Refugees, the disabled, all sorts of groups have had to fight for some sort of recognition, redistribution, respect, all of these things. So I think that is really important to recognize that that's the motor. It's not, again, and that's why deconstructing the kind of founding fathers thing is important too, right? It's not just this creation that came out of the brains of this few at the center. And democracy isn't just now the people who are at the center who are in charge of things. So immigration today, I think, is really important because that's part of, we exclude based on whether or not you have papers, whether were you born on that side of the Rio Grande or this side. Yeah. And you know what? That's going to determine your life chances more than how hard you work, more than what ideas you have, right? It's just this totally arbitrary thing of what passport are you born with. And it determines, it shapes life and death. And so, and it's interesting because early in this country's history, there was no such thing as exclusion based on citizenship. There's what was called alien suffrage. You could vote in many, many communities in the United States, even if you weren't American, as long as you were a white man who met certain property requirements, right? Exclusions were based on other things, not citizenship. So I personally think membership in a democratic community should be more based on residency, on connection to the community, right? Like, I have American citizenship arbitrarily in my view, because my grandfather, who was living in Canada, worked for American immigration. But I think I deserve to be American because I've lived here my whole life. I put so much into this community. I care about it, it's just this arbitrary thing of blood and soil as membership. And again, that's fungible, that's evolved through time, that's changeable. Also, I filmed in Greece at the set, in the minute of these dual crises, a financial crisis and what's called the refugee crisis, which is really, just the fact that, we can't figure out how to make space for a totally reasonable number of people who are fleeing devastation. So, I don't quite know what to call that. I don't really like the phrase refugee crisis. But certainly immigration was a massive issue. And then also obviously in the United States with this ethno-nationalist turn. So I think it's absolutely central to me to the question of democracy today, because the central question of democracy is who is we? Who are we and who will we be, right? So the we is always there and it's always shifting, and it can become more open and more small d democratic and more humane, or more exclusive, ethno-nationalist and dangerous, in my view.
Yeah, I thought that your point made me really think of the movements that have pushed democracy is the fight for inclusion. And you talk about women, and we talk about African Americans with abolitionists of slavery, as well as civil rights, workers' rights. And now we've got the movement for nature being included in that. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and that's why I say who we're not done, right? We haven't necessarily identified all the categories worthy of inclusion consideration, in our demos in this democracy.
And the discipline you talk about, hope being a discipline, because these movements took a long time. They just didn't happen overnight, and people didn't give up so quickly there. Let me go to next question here. At the end of the film, when you're in Italy talking about democracy in the home and in the bedroom, and it reminded me of the role of women in society and governance. And a lot of the community groups we've worked with, like this is coming from, I think, a person with OHCRN, or SELDF, where the men seem very concerned about the monetary economics, and the women are more concerned about future generations and the effects decisions will have on them. I know in Iceland was one country where a female majority in government and the first elected woman president exists. In your research into past democracies, did you find others that had more with women being elected? And if not, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I can't say that I found many examples. I mean, there are obviously examples of matriarchal societies. I didn't focus on them. So I guess I'll begin this with a big caveat of I'm not an ethnographer, I'm not an anthropologist. There are other societies. And I was, focusing on the Western political and philosophical tradition and then kind of troubling that. And one thing, I don't know if Sylvia says it I think she might say it in the film, but she definitely said it in the interview. And she just said, within that tradition, right, democracy has not really been a friend of women. I mean, we really only have, women's suffrage around in these various, Western countries around World War I. And that is recent history. This is not, we haven't been doing this very long. I think it's incredibly important to have gender equality and gender justice. I'm not an essentialist. I'm not, I don't have empirical evidence of whether if women ruled the world, it would be better. But and I think there were some really problematic arguments made among the first wave of women suffragists, right? In fact, there were some, and even some women we really lionized, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who said, they had been fighting for a long time for women's equality. And then when Black men were enfranchised first, they said, well, now we need women's suffrage even more so educated white women can counter this, right? So in other words, there's always also been a reactionary element in this demand too, which doesn't totally, it's just to say that these dynamics are very complicated. And so that's why, for me, it has to be tied to a material economic analysis, right? Like, I want women's equality within the context of equalizing society as a whole. So I would like to see a less pyramid-shaped society and a more equal one, instead of a world where, women being full women being full political subjects just means there are, more women CEOs or women bankers or whatever, right? And I do think what Silvia Federici brings to the film, what was so important to me, was to see this, she's a Marxist, but she's adapting Marx. So she says, there's not just the world of production of what we see in factories of like traditional paid work, right? And what we as Americans, especially like revere, is like, oh, that's work because you get paid for it and it's out of the home. And she says, well, there's this whole world of reproduction, of actually caring for human beings, reproducing social life that goes unpaid and also isn't valued. And this is like the most important work. And it's ecologically non-violent, right? It's like caring and teaching and nursing and taking care of children and the elderly and all these things. And like, that's the work we need to actually figure out how to value, both by, remunerating people so they can, just focus on it, but also like really recognizing that that's the important stuff of life. And I think that is a very important feminist lens. And to just say that, the home is a political sphere, that all this work of care is really valuable, for me was an important note to end on. And also, at the end, Silvia and I talk about feminism. That's the very last film of the scene. And I was kind of hoping that would also, for the viewer would go, oh, there actually were a lot of women in this movie, because I really tried to, whether they're 12 or 13 years old in the school, to Silvia, who is in her late 70s, I really tried to show women I tried to make a feminist film because women have been locked out of the democratic discourse.
Yeah, that makes me think about the fact that women, a lot of women, probably majority, are in early childhood education. Of course, there are men, and they're paid pittance.
Yeah.
But most of the money for education goes at the top. Well, don't we have to create the foundation, and shouldn't the priorities be there? Like I
totally agree. Yeah.
So,
and I think we are having an interesting moment where people are talking about care work. I think that's one thing. The pandemic, there are these. Pandemic has not been the awakening that one hopes it would be, but I think people have seen that care work is, and that this work of caring is really tough, and that taking care of children and teaching and all this stuff. And, there's a Representative Jamal Bowman in New York who is very progressive, who just put out a care platform. And so I see people, I do think that that's also, it is, and it's kind of ideas that people like feminists like Silvia Federici put out 40 years ago, finally trickling up to the mainstream. And, another example of just sticking with it and just sticking with these ideas that matter.
Okay, well, let's see. Next question here is, have you been able to get invited to any non-choir, quote, conservative Republican media outlets, Fox News or what, to show that we are all in the same boat, perhaps using a few different catchwords like such as heritage, etc. Yeah, just your thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, the film wasn't, it definitely hasn't crossed over into the Republican media chamber. It's interesting because I think this implicit in that, though, is a question about how one approaches changing minds. So I think for me, democracy is not a poll. It's not just what the people think right now. We are creating the demos, and that's why we have philosophical debates about things. The demos shifts over time in what we think and what we value. And so for me, part of, activism and part of democracy is engaging in the process of trying to change other people's minds and also hopefully having your mind changed in that. But I guess I think it's not just media, it's not just messages, it's not just information. It's actually the most powerful way to transform people and to build unlikely alliances and that solidarity with people who might be different from you is actually by organizing and by doing stuff. So that's why I focus on, it's another reason I work on debtor organizing. It's like, look, we might have different cultural tastes. We might come from different areas. You might be rural, I might be urban, or vice versa, or whatever, but we're all struggling to pay our bills.
Yeah.
And so could we come, right? And so, for example, we're working a lot on student debt cancellation. 1 in 5 Trump voters said they'd vote Democrat if student debt was canceled. So I think it's these things like, what is it, where can we connect on things like we can't pay our bills, basic things, and then have conversations from there. And sometimes I think we focus too much on just argument and this abstraction that's disconnected from life in our experiences.
Okay, yeah. One of the quotes in the film there that mentioned, back to the idea of local, and you could just, maybe you've touched on this already, but that she said that we have to use local democracy, and this has to do with the inclusion, exclusion idea, but we have to use local democracy to hopefully dismantle the global anti-democratic forces that are mentioned there.
Yeah, I think that question, the tension between the local and the global, which obviously you all are thinking about too, is really a tough one. So so each chapter of the book, the film, so someone asked me about whether in the chat, whether narration might be good. And for me, the film is more about the politics of listening. It's about listening. So I wrote an essay in the New Yorker called The Right to Listen that talks a bit about some of the thinking that went into the film. And, democracy is about demos, it's about the people. So the film listens to all these different kinds of people, and I think tries to get, I hope that, is kind of gives the viewer a chance to hear from people they wouldn't otherwise hear from. And I knew I could write my book. So my book is nothing but me narrating and getting to say what I want to say. But the book is structured in such a way that each chapter is about a paradox or a tension central to democracy. So something will never resolve. And we will never be able to resolve the tension of the local and the global, right? We live rooted in place in communities. I mean, we're rooted to different degrees. Some of us are more nomadic than others. I'm pretty nomadic, but, and then we are affected by these global currents, whether it's a pandemic, climate change, capitalism, right? These are global things that, and how to figure out, when we know the problems are global, how to figure out how do you reach up to that scale and tackle things, it's really tricky. And I think you can't skip to that level. You have to do it by being rooted in a place. But that chapter was the toughest of all the chapters in the book to write because it's such a tricky issue. I mean, people on the left have long dreamed of internationalism, right? That's kind of our aspiration. And I think we're in a moment where, as Noam Chomsky said recently, it is internationalism or extinction. And yet it's a really hard thing to do. It's hard to figure out how to collaborate with people in your town, let alone with people on the other side of the world. So but we have to keep at it.
Yeah. Can't we also make local actions, but recognize that we have to recognize the rights of all people there, and not just our right to take advantage of others, which is what a lot of capitalism has done for us.
Yeah, I think if somebody said think globally, act locally, it's just, it's a cliche and a slogan because it's actually pretty right on,
Yeah.
It's hard to act globally. I mean, we do that through our local actions, but.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see if, okay, some of them are comments here, which great. Another one that I thought about is in your film, like Angela Davis.
Yeah.
She said, we need to abolish rather than fix a system, that it cannot be fixed. We need a creation of new institutions and conditions, not the democracy of the white fathers. So yeah, I know that sounds hard for people, but it seems like, like I mentioned about all the things, the impediments that the system has, and it seems well entrenched that somehow you have to get people to start thinking that, well, we need to question not just the Constitution, but how we're doing things. What do what do you think about some of the questions?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I did get to have a long Zoom conversation with Angela Davis during the pandemic. So that was one of the many.
Saw that one.
Yeah. And so I did ask her also about the rights of non-human beings. So that was an interesting exchange. I mean, I think it's important to ground the term abolition, which I think a lot of us think of as very negative, right? I'm going to abolish that. So for example, we at the Debt Collective, we talk about the cancellation of debt, but also the abolition of debts. And when we use the word abolition, we're actually using it in the Angela Davis sense, which goes back to the wonderful historian and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, whose amazing book on Reconstruction. I mean, he said that because what it was, he's writing about the abolition of slavery, but he said that what was suppressed by the Redeemers, right, by the basically Confederacy 2.0 was abolition democracy. In other words, abolition is always both the taking away, so taking away the institutions of slavery, these oppressive institutions, but also the building up of new institutions, new structures. Democracy isn't spontaneous. In my opinion, solidarity is not spontaneous. We need relationships and structures to encourage them. So she's conjuring that wonderful idea from Du Bois of abolition democracy, the removing of oppression and oppressive structures and exploitation, and the building of these new systems of inclusion. And so we saw some of these, when she says we need to abolish the system, she's talking also about what was starting to be built in the South, even here in North Carolina, where I am, after the end of slavery, where there were multiracial populist, movements that were saying education for everyone, representation, like real, people should have access to the political sphere and those levers of power, public goods that are not, that are not discriminatory, worker ownership, cooperatives, all of these things that, are still things people are trying to build today. So I think, that's actually what she's articulating there is a really positive vision, but it's one that does go deeper. It's just saying that really there does need to be profound structural change and a deep rebalancing of power, and that people have made progress towards that over and over again, and then it was violently attacked. And so I'm thinking right now about, we're seeing a replay of that in Georgia. So I grew up in Athens, Georgia, which is a few hours from where I'm sitting now. And so what did we see, on that at that runoff? We saw two progressive senators win Georgia. And so people say Georgia turned blue, but really it's always been more liberal than the elected officials indicated, right? Because there's so much voter suppression. There's people are so demoralized. So people organized for years. They got turnout. They elected these two Democrats who are running on progressive things like debt cancellation, right? I mean, when you compare them to who they were competing against, it's pretty remarkable. And what did we see this week? We saw the Georgia Republican power structure pass a voter suppression law that makes it illegal to hand out water to people standing in line. So it's legal to make it so hard to vote that people have to stand in line and, for 8, 9, 10 hours, but it's illegal to have that humanity and that solidarity and offer them a drink so that they can stay there and exercise their basic rights. I mean, that's basically a replay of what was happening in the 19th century. And so that abolition democracy is still, a huge threat. But so I guess I think what Angela Davis is saying there, it's like, it's radical in the sense that you got to get to the root. We've got to get to the root and try to bring this multiracial small d democracy into being.
Yeah. Okay. Another question on the idea of governance by lottery, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
And similar to random jury selection, but so the idea that people should be paid to take part in governance. Lobbyists are paid, elected officials are paid, yet people are expected to volunteer when having other jobs. Could universal basic income be used for this?
I think that's there are kind of two parts to that question. I guess one is, why sortition, why election? So sortition just means random selection. And so this is one of the interesting things about, again, democracy being paradoxical. I mean, you can learn things from people who are imperfect. You can learn things from societies that have lots of problems. So the ancient Greeks was a society based on slavery. They were deeply imperialist, right? Women were totally excluded, but they were really interesting in terms of figuring out how to include. So their demos, their we was very circumscribed. It was citizens, male citizens, but in that limited sense of who the we was, they were really creative about finding ways to make sure that poor people were included in political life. And they also had an attitude, basically, of democracy is something everyone has the capacity to do. You don't need some special expertise. And they also thought that elections were very undemocratic. They thought elections were, Aristotle says this, elections are aristocratic, because who's going to win an election? Someone who's the most well-spoken or well-connected or has money for bribes. And so they were very vigilant about nobody being allowed to, you couldn't profit off of politics. That was like a big no. And they, tried to use elections very fleetingly. They used them in certain areas, but for the most part, they thought, okay, what we should do is randomly select people because that will train the people in democracy, and you'll learn to run the city by running it. That's what we're going to do. And they understood that they had to compensate artisans and farmers. They had to compensate workers so that they could do this, right? You had to be able to get your day's wage, because that's who can afford to actually drop everything and let their fields go fallow so that they can go to Athens and run the business of the city. So it's interesting today, there was a young woman named Nabala, I think her name is Nabala Islam, who was running for Congress. She didn't win. She was primarying, or it was an open seat anyway. And she has been very vocal these days about the fact that actually the one area where politicians should be able to access some more funds is that people should be able to pay themselves a living wage out of their campaigning funds. Because so many people, so I don't know, people probably know Cori Bush, who is now a congresswoman from Missouri, who is a Black Lives Matter activist. I interviewed her when she was running. She could barely live. She didn't have health insurance. She got COVID. She had no health care. Nabila was in a similar boat, no health care, because these are working class people who don't just have a big bank account to draw on to support them while they run for office. So, it's interesting. There's all sorts of opportunities once you win office to enrich yourself, and there's a revolving door. But to get up that escalator, to get in the door, in the first door, right, there's all these barriers that are based on, and a lot of them are based on money. So she's been pushing to say, if we want more working class people to be able to run for office, we actually need to let them access like a living wage from their campaign donations. So I think, but I think election day should be a holiday. You pay people. Yeah. Compensate people, because if you're a working, this is why the thing in Georgia is so egregious. You're standing in line for 10 hours and you've missed work. Right. Yeah. And also it's just, they cut down voting days. So does it coincide with your work schedule? There are all of these subtle ways in which our system disenfranchises poor and working people. Mm-hmm. And, it's very privileged to think, oh, voting's easy. I'll just drive in my car to like the voting site where there's no line. Well, a lot of people don't have a car. Yeah, exactly. And then you've decimated public transport. So mm-hmm. These are all things that I think the Greeks did a better job of thinking about than we did. And so we should also have a little less, to use a famous concept or favorite concept of theirs, have a little less hubris. Mm-hmm. And and see what we could learn from other ways of structuring things, so that there's
Yeah.
more equality in terms of this sort of class equality.
Yeah, when you talk about voting, here's a question. It says, do you think ranked choice voting is a strong tactic for our country to open up democracy?
Yeah. Oh, I would also say on the UBI front, because I'm at universal basic income, I'm for universal basic income as long as there's all of these other social services. I think there's a way, I just want to say, because the original sort of libertarian philosophers who pushed for universal basic income, for example, Milton Friedman and others, they wanted to get rid of the rest of the welfare state. And I think that's quite undemocratic. In other words, right, it's kind of just like, oh, give cash to people and they can buy what they want. They can use their freedom to purchase. And I think a democratic society provides social services, and then yes, nobody should, and then you could have a universal basic income. I just am wary of it being promoted as an alternative to other social services. But yeah, ranked choice voting I think is definitely an improvement. It's, why should we have, we have this idea of one person, one vote, which we don't really have. We certainly don't have equal votes given the inequalities of our political system, as we've discussed. But why not have 3 votes and you can rank them?
Yeah.
I mean, it would help progressives a lot, because obviously then there would be less problems with lesser, choosing. There'd be less problems with spoiling a ticket, right? So you could vote for the person that you actually want to have win, who might have less of a chance. So ranked choice voting is now happening in New York, and I think that, and obviously in Maine and other places. So I think it's a really promising development. I mean, nothing is a panacea, but I think it's far better than what we have and really important.
Yeah. Here's another question. It says, is global democracy, I don't know what's really meant by that, but possible since it requires trust within communities? That's a lot of trust to ask for when we rely on a show of national force, offense, aggression.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, is global democracy possible? We don't know. I imagine it would have to have some sort of, it would have to be federated, right? It would have to have some sort of concentric democratic structures that builds up to the global level. Again, I don't think you can just jump there and have global democracy. So, and there's something very colonialist and kind of imperial about that too, right? Well, who gets to dictate who this one supposedly democratic system is? So I think somehow there still has to be that room for difference and experimentation and human diversity that, would federate to that level. We haven't quite figured it out, that's for sure.
Yeah. So here's another one. It says people's movements are breaking out around the world and then some crushed, a lot of them. Clearly we need to unite internationally, but how? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be concrete about, well, what are the areas of alliance? I mean, there have been some amazing international solidarity movements, solidarity with Latin America and all, so there are some precedents. I think the global justice movement was really promising with its focus on trade agreements and these international economic institutions like the World Trade Organization, the IMF. And that period was also married with the call for a debt jubilee in terms of sovereign debt. So thinking, so that was I think a really good international movement. And then 9/11, came and kind of stole the wind from its sails. So I think recovering some of that focus would be good. Concretely, I suppose one thing about global capitalism is it gives us common targets. So I was interviewing some Uber drivers who are organizing effectively a union for Uber workers in LA, and they had organized an international strike, a day of action, right? Because drivers in many countries work for Uber. So I think following those, where do we have common targets and common problems? We just have to do that work of organizing and finding out where we have alliances and where we can put pressure and act in solidarity. So yeah, there's no Jane McAlevey, the great union organizer who's written many books I recommend, she always says there's no shortcuts. It's certainly the case.
Back to another way of things, institutions of democracy, citizen assemblies.
Yeah.
And like Chile, I know they're starting to take place there, and maybe other places I'm not aware of. And they're working on rewriting their constitution there. So what do you know? What would you like to say about those?
Yeah, I think citizens assemblies, I mean, one thing that's unique about the US is how hard it is to change our constitution, right? We don't have the same ability. So, it's fascinating what's happening in Chile and the fact that they're embarking on that experiment. I would love to be a fly on the wall. Citizens assemblies were also, so citizens assemblies basically they have this, kind of a randomly selected group of citizens who represent the population, and they were used in really interesting ways in Ireland. So after the financial crisis, there was a deep distrust of the government for good reason. So one thing, and under pressure from academics and activists, one thing the Irish government said was, okay, we'll do a citizens assembly. So they selected, I don't remember the exact number, but people who represented the population in terms of geography, age, gender, all of these things, right? And that this group would kind of deliberate as a representative of the people. And eventually what happened, this iterated, and so this group, to make a long story short, basically was tasked by the government at one point with just talking about whether or not the Irish Constitution should be amended to allow abortion. And so what they did was they deliberated for months. It was live streamed, but they heard from all sorts of groups, experts, activists, all these things. And so it was like as if the whole country had deliberated, right? And seen this thing. And then they basically recommended, they were like, yeah, we recommend, we've thought about it. We recommend the Constitution be amended. You know what? Like, this is it. And then they had a plebiscite. So then they had a vote, with the whole country, and the country voted to amend the Constitution. So it's quite interesting. What some people have asked is what would have happened with Brexit if they had had a similar deliberative process with the Citizens Assembly, right? Because it's a very blunt instrument to say, okay, country, yes or no, right? Leave the EU or not, or, legalize abortion or not. What this did was this gave the kind of, people a forum to follow along in this discourse and to feel that, okay, these people are just regular people. They're not out to be reelected. They don't have some other agenda. Like, they might have their point of view. They might have their values. They might be Catholic. They might be, liberal, but they're just there to actually kind of in good faith engage with this discussion. So I think there's lots of, I think it has huge potential, but it has to be tied to real power, right? You can't just have a citizens assembly and then,
exactly.
But like nothing happens, and it just becomes one of these charades that we're talking about.
Right.
But I think it is a really interesting way for people to, for this smaller group that represents the larger group to kind of do a kind of learning process, deliberative process that people have some trust and some faith in because they're randomly selected.
Yeah. And
but I mean, to think about Ireland also legalizing abortion, I mean, what you would think that's the most intractable issue.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And people accepted it. People, of course, some people lost. They voted, for the status quo, but they felt it was legitimate because they had been through this process. And I think that's also really key. Perhaps the vote would have gone the same way without this process, but the country wouldn't have felt like, oh, we thought it through. And well, you know what? I guess this is where people are. And I'm going to accept change.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I don't want to keep you much past. I know it's coming on an hour, but I just wanted to ask you, what gives you hope? What do you see as promising signs, and about where we some of the things where we should put our energy?
I mean, I think that what gives me hope is, I think hope is a discipline. So I think you just got to have it. But I mean, people are talking about ideas that, I mean, for me, I feel like I can just be so much more honest about my political values. And, even I'm someone who I came of age, I was 20 at 9/11. And then there was the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, bringing democracy to the Middle East. And it was such a politically oppressive time. I mean, there were no social movements. So I I'm very heartened by the fact, I mean, I never would have imagined that we'd have self-proclaimed socialists, not just, AOC and the most visible, but at the local level in Georgia, on city councils of small towns. And I think there is a kind of attention to these economic issues, these material issues, these structural issues that I didn't feel was present 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So that is hopeful. And I think there's a real awareness about the importance of organizing and building power and being strategic. So even though a lot of us are on social media, blasting our opinions and tweeting and stuff, I think I think people are quite aware that you actually need to figure out how to act as a social bloc to move the debates forward. So I guess I see, maybe I'm just comparing it to the desert, the desert I experienced in my youth, but I feel like I just feel like there are a lot of promising signs, and that it's our duty to take those openings and try to push as far as we can. I do, as I said, I'm organizing with the Debt Collective. So we have our week of action for student debt cancellation. This week, we've got actions, I don't think any in Ohio, but all over the country. And I think that, part of what gives me hope is that I was part of Occupy Wall Street, and we had a protest for student debt cancellation and free college, and the media response was, they just laughed at us. They said, well, this is ridiculous. Can you imagine these people think the government would ever cancel their student debt? Well, now we've since then won through organizing debt strikes and launching some creative legal challenges. We have forced the Department of Education to erase $2 billion of debt. And Joe Biden, even though he didn't run on canceling all student debt, the fact that Joe Biden, who made his entire career being basically carrying water for credit card companies in Delaware, ran on canceling some student debt, is something we could never have imagined. And there wasn't that many of us doing this. So I think the takeaway for me is like, wow, if we can do this, imagine if there were 10 times as many people or 100 times as many people. We really only do win what we organize for. And, but that, it's been 10 years, and 10 years from just being mocked to the president of the United States and someone who I think of as conservative, basically, speaking our language to a degree is, to me, just makes me all the more hopeful that if more people got involved, we could do even more.
Yeah, definitely. So when you talk about if we have more people involved with our community rights groups, then we think, what if we had 100 of these throughout Ohio?
Exactly.
Or we had more? Wouldn't that then gain more power? So we could say that, most people agree, shouldn't we have the right in our own community to keep out harmful things and exactly. Community rights can be used for social justice issues as well as environmental too. So if people want more information, they can go to our website, Ohio CRN, Ohio Community Rights Network.org, and simplyliving.org, right, Chuck? Correct? And this has been great, and reminding people that they still have a chance to see the film until tomorrow evening if they haven't had a chance. But I think hopefully most of you have already, and might want to watch it again. And Astra's book.
And come to the second one. I said they should come to. They should go. I said they should watch Invisible Hand because I want to see that.
Oh yes, definitely. And check our website out. Thanks for mentioning that. Invisible Hand, which is basically the first movie about rights of nature, and it is been updated. It's great. It will be shown in a format like this on just after Earth Day, April 25th, Sunday, again at 2 p.m. will be the Q&A, and the same thing. You'll have 24 hours beforehand to watch the film. You'll get the link. So please join us for that. We'll have Marky Miller from Toledoans for Safe Water, who's in the film and talks about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, and of course related to Grand Township and what they've gone through and other issues involved with rights in nature. So yeah, please join us for that. And then we'll be having more films. We're going to have the new corporation later on in August, and then we'll have another movie after that. So thank you so much, Astra. This has been wonderful, and really appreciate your time and your work. And we've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, and I'm cheering you on from North Carolina, so thank you for all you do. I think another thing that, you know, keeps me going is just knowing we don't have to do it all ourselves. We just hold our little bit where we can, and trust that other people are focusing on all these other vital issues. So thanks for doing what you're doing. And thanks for having me and for sharing my movie. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much. All right, thanks everybody for joining us.
Thanks,
and hopefully you can join us for Invisible Hand, April 25th, 2 p.m. Thank you.
Bye.